The 5th century saw the fall of the Roman Empire in the West. It was a terrible century. It was a century when the central Roman power just dissolved and faded away. And probably it took a couple of lifetimes. People possibly never really quite realised what was happening. But the civil servants were so badly taxed, they went off to their country estates and never came back. The country estates became large farms and then self-contained farms and then towns. The Latin word villa originally meant a farm, and it's the word ville, a town in French. But men of culture looked with despair at the remorseless decay of learning and civilization. Boethius wrote a book called The Consolation of Philosophy, compressing into a single book what he thought was the most vital to be preserved of all the vast learning of antiquity. His book was indeed used as almost the only available textbook for many centuries. And we do know that the Great Library of Alexandria had 1 million books in it. And what were they? Who knows now? The 5th century saw the climax of the barbarian invasions. This had been continuing for centuries. Most of the people who came in, most of the people who came in were not trying to destroy the empire at all. They wanted the goodies, but just by coming in, they destroyed the fabric that was supporting it. People who just think there should be unrestricted immigration, look what happened in Rome. But never mind about that. But what had happened by the 5th century was that the Roman legions were nearly all staffed by what they called auxiliaries who weren't Roman at all, maybe didn't even speak Latin. So in the end, the army wasn't a Roman army. And in the end, they just had to give up all pretense. The barbarian tribes included the Goths, the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, the Lombards, the Franks and the Vandals, and later in the 5th century came the Huns. The last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the new barbarian king in the year 476. That was 1228 years after the traditional founding of the city of Rome. And the ancient pagan prophecy of the 12 eagles was fulfilled, that Rome would endure for 12 centuries. Now we believe that King Arthur was a real person, and he ruled in what was then called Logres, which is now called England, early in the 5th century, and he's believed to have led the Catholic Britons and Romans against the heathen invading Saxons, and it is said that his grave was despoiled by the Protestants in the 16th century. We could speak more about the collapse, but there was a terrible collapse around the world. Yet, well, the known world. Yet just as the Roman world was collapsing, a new and amazingly strong Catholic civilization was being built in faraway Ireland. It was in the 5th century that St. Patrick came and converted the pagan Irish in a single generation. Never before or since has a whole nation taken to the faith so readily and so peacefully. During the 40 days of the Lenten season of 441, St. Patrick remained in prayer and fasting at the summit of Crowpatrick, and you can hear about that on YouTube and other places. I won't stop to talk about it now, but it was a turning point, not just for Ireland, but for civilization and the world. And at the end of the 5th century, the Franks, the French, became Catholic, and his band of barbarian-speaking warriors established control over much of the Roman province of Gaul, soon adopting a version of the Latin language and Roman law, and mingling with the native population, and their language developed into French. The ties with Rome helped greatly to strengthen his kingdom, while many of the other small kingdoms who stuck to their own tribal languages and the Aryan religion, they have melted away, but France is still with us. The 6th century saw the beginning of the Golden Age of Ireland and the Dark Ages of Europe. Now, the word Dark Ages is used far too much, and often with polemical means, in other words, trying to make a political point. But there's a lot to be said for the 6th and the 7th century being the real Dark Ages, because dark can mean unknown in Older English, and we know hardly anything about these 2 centuries because the art of writing just about totally disappeared for a period of 200 years. And if you want to get some idea of what the world was like in those days, we can see archaeologically the remains of beautiful Roman villas with lovely mosaics on the floor, and the remains of bonfires where people had been squatting round, roasting and eating cats and dogs. That's where the world had got to. But by an almost miraculous transformation, again and again, a brutal barbarian horde would invade Europe, become converted to Christianity, and within a single generation settle down as a civilized Christian nation. In Italy, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian had actually driven out the Ostrogoths, but before long the imperial forces were defeated by another barbarian tribe, the Longbeards or Lombards, who conquered nearly all of Italy. They adopted the Catholic faith and allowed the Pope to remain in Rome, and for the Church to continue her work. In Britain, the Angles, Saxons and Jutes had established their culture in the central and southern parts of the island. The descendants of the native Romano-British had forgotten their Celtic past, and the new Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had no intercourse with the Britons in the faraway mountains, calling them the foreigners, or in their language, the Welsh. And the very name of Logres was forgotten in the south and east, and the invaders renamed their new country Angleland or England. The Welsh remained Catholic. The Angles and Saxons still worshipped their pagan gods. Excuse me. In Spain, the conquering Visigoths, with their capital at Toledo, had adopted Arianism, but the native population of Roman and native Hispanic descent had remained Catholic. The Visigothic king Recared left the Arian heresy and adopted the Catholic faith, his public confession being read out at the Third Council of Toledo. And the conversion of Visigothic Spain, which had remained the last bastion of Arianism, marked its final end. Arianism just kind of trickled out. In Constantinople, many of the arts and traditions of the old empire were maintained. In the first part of the 6th century, St. Benedict founded the first monastery. Before that, monks had lived as hermits, and his monks spent their day in prayer, farm work, and the copying of precious manuscripts. They also took a vow of stability. They'd stay where they were. Stability was the one thing that the world needed then, and St. Benedict is the patron saint of Europe. And once again, the story of the Benedictine monasteries can be known or found out in many places. They went out into the wilderness, and because the way of Christ worked, before long there were prosperous towns and then cities. Many of the modern cities of Europe began as Benedictine communities in the wasteland. And the Benedictine rule formed the basis, perhaps, for the new civilization which was to grow. Pope St. Gregory the Great lived at the end of the 6th century and into the 7th. We'll mention him when we come to it.